The world spins in a red-brown haze, each ragged breath a fresh betrayal. Silas Kane presses a hand to his side, the rough fabric of his shirt already stiff and dark with blood. Dust coats his tongue, thick as mud. He stumbles onward, his boots scuffing against scorched earth and brittle rock, leaving a trail for any man or beast with the sense to follow. Behind him lies the echo of gunfire and the ghost of a partner who talked too much. Ahead lies nothing but the vast, indifferent emptiness of the territories. He needs shelter. He needs water. Most of all, he needs the bleeding to stop. Through the shimmering heat, a shape wavers on the horizon, the skeletal remains of a homestead, its bones picked clean by fire. A grim comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. Walls, even broken ones, might offer a moment's peace from the relentless sun and the eyes he feels boring into his back. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The ruins offer no welcome, only the acrid smell of old smoke and sorrow. He collapses against the stone chimney, the last standing sentinel of a forgotten life, and slides down its length to the ground. The pain in his side is a living thing, a hot coal pressed against his ribs. He fumbles with his canteen, his fingers clumsy and slick. Empty, of course. He closes his eyes, the sun a searing white brand even through his eyelids. Let them come, he thinks. Let Thorn find him. Let it end here in the dust and the silence. He drifts, pulled under by a tide of exhaustion and blood loss. The world fades to a low hum, then to nothing. And with 3 words whispered in the dark of his own mind, I am done, his life, and another's, were irrevocably changed. The first thing he felt was a touch. It was impossibly light, a feather's caress against the back of his blood-caked hand. It was so gentle, so out of place in the harsh reality of his pain, that for a moment he thought it was a phantom of his fevered mind. He remained still, his breath shallow, listening. The only sounds were the low moan of the wind through the broken walls and the frantic drumming of his own heart. The touch came again, hesitant, a tiny pressure on his knuckles. Slowly, fighting a wave of dizziness that threatened to pull him back under, Silas forced his eyes open. The world swam into focus, a blurry mess of gray stone and pale sky. He blinked, and the image sharpened. A face, a small, smudged face framed by a wild tangle of sun-bleached hair, dominated by 2 enormous, dark eyes that held the vacant stillness of deep shock. It was a child, a girl, no older than 5 or 6, clad in a tattered dress the color of dust. She was kneeling beside him, her expression unreadable, her tiny hand hovering just above his. She didn't speak. She didn't cry or show any fear of the bloodied, grim-faced man lying in the ruins of her home. She simply watched him, her gaze ancient and unervingly direct. In her other arm, she clutched a small, lumpy doll made from scraps of sacking, its button eyes staring out with the same blankness as her own. Silas tried to sit up, a groan tearing from his throat as the fire in his side flared. The movement, slight as it was, made the child flinch back, her hand darting away as if she'd touched a hot skillet. She didn't run, though. She just watched. Easy there, Silas rasped, his voice a dry crackle. I ain't gonna hurt you. The words felt foreign and useless in his mouth. He was a hurt animal himself, and hurt animals were dangerous. She had every right to be afraid. He pushed himself up with his good arm until his back was flat against the chimney stones. The world tilted precariously, but he fought it, gritting his teeth. He had to assess the situation. He was wounded, without water, and now, inexplicably, he was not alone. He looked around the ruins properly. The fire had been thorough. The main cabin was a charcoal skeleton of timbers and fallen sod. A small barn had collapsed into a heap of blackened wood. Nothing was left. No sign of life, no livestock, no wagon. Just the wind, the silence, and this ghost of a child. He looked back at her. Her stillness was profound. It wasn't the quiet of a well-behaved child. It was the silence of trauma, a wall built around a pain too large to articulate. Your folks? He asked, his voice softer this time. She gave no reply. Her gaze flickered from his face to the bloodstains spreading on his shirt, then back again. He understood. There was no one else. The people who had built this place, who had loved this child, were gone. He didn't need to see the unmarked mounds of earth near the collapsed porch to know it. He could feel their absence in the oppressive quiet. A cold knot formed in his gut, a feeling entirely separate from the pain of his wound. This was a complication he could not afford. His life was a series of movements, of running from one shadow to the next. His past was a gallery of wanted posters, his name, or one of his many names, scrawled beneath a poor likeness. Jedediah Thorne and his men were not the kind to give up a chase easily. They'd track him to the ends of the earth for the perceived betrayal, for the money he'd taken. Silas's plan had been simple: get across the Red Hills, lose them in the canyons, and disappear into the anonymity of the Western Territories. A child did not fit into that plan. A child was an anchor, a liability, a death sentence. He had to leave her. It was the only logical thing to do. Find water, get his bearings, and move on. Someone else would find her eventually. A patrol, a prospector. Someone better suited to the task. He was poison. Everything he touched withered. He looked at her again, at the way her small fingers were clenched around the sackcloth doll, her knuckles white. He saw the faint outline of a bruise on her cheek, faded now, but there. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he couldn't leave her. Leaving her here would be no different than putting his own pistol to her head. The coyotes, the exposure, the loneliness, they would claim her before the next sunset. His own harsh childhood flickered through his mind, an orphanage in St. Louis where kindness was a currency he never possessed. He remembered the gnawing hunger, the cold, the casual cruelty of the bigger boys and the weary indifference of the matrons. He had survived by becoming hard, by learning to hit first, to trust no one. He had run from that place as soon as he was big enough, and he had been running ever since. He saw the same desolate emptiness in this girl's eyes that he had once seen in his own reflection in a dirty pane of glass. Damn it all, he muttered, the curse a prayer of resignation. He needed water. For both of them now. He scanned the homestead again, his scout's eye picking out details he'd missed. A faint path led away from the back of the cabin toward a small clutch of cottonwoods. A well. There had to be a well. Using the chimney for support, he hauled his aching body to his feet. The world swayed violently, and black spots danced in his vision. He stood still for a long moment, breathing shallowly, waiting for the spell to pass. The little girl scrambled back, putting a few more feet between them, but her eyes never left him. She was like a wary fawn, ready to bolt but too curious or too broken to flee. Stay here, he ordered, though the command was weak. He wasn't sure if she understood or even cared. He limped toward the cottonwoods, each step a fresh agony. The bullet had gone clean through, a small mercy, but it had torn through muscle and left a ragged path. Infection was the real danger now. Without medicine, without clean bandages, a simple gunshot could turn into a slow, feverish death. He found the well, its stone lip crumbling, a rotted wooden bucket lying beside it. He peered down into the darkness. It was deep, and he could smell the faint, cool scent of damp earth, but he couldn't see if any water remained. The rope was gone, likely burned in the fire. He returned to the ruins, his hope dwindling. The girl hadn't moved. She was a small statue of sorrow, watching him with those hollow eyes. He had nothing to offer her. He was a dying man with a ghost for a companion. Defeated, he sank back to the ground, his head falling back against the stone. This was it. This was the ignoble end of Silas Kane. Not in a blaze of glory, not in a final stand against Thorne, but bleeding out in a forgotten ruin next to a silent child. He must have passed out again, because when he awoke, the sun was lower in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and bruised purple. The air was cooler, and something was different. A small, dented tin cup sat on the ground beside him, filled with an inch of murky water. He stared at it, his mind sluggish. He looked over at the girl. She was sitting where he'd last seen her, but now she was watching the well. He followed her gaze and saw it. A length of old leather strap, perhaps from a horse's harness, tied to the cup's handle. She had lowered it again and again, patiently, to collect what little water remained at the bottom of the well. For him. He picked up the cup, his hand trembling. He looked at the cloudy water, then at the child. She had not done this for herself. She had done this for the dangerous stranger who had collapsed in her desolate world. He drank. The water was gritty and warm, but it was the most precious thing he had ever tasted. It was a gift of trust, a small act of grace in a world that had shown neither of them any. When he finished, he set the cup down. He looked at her, really looked at her, past the dirt and the tattered dress. He saw not just a victim, but a survivor. She had been alone here for days, maybe longer, and she had survived. She had found a way. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. She didn't respond, but he thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a brief spark in the vast emptiness. He knew then that his journey had changed. He was no longer just running from his past. He was now running toward a future, any future, that could keep this child safe. Silver Creek. It was a 3-day ride, if a man was healthy and had a horse. On foot, wounded, with a small child in tow, it could take a week. A week was a lifetime, but it was the only direction he had. He tore a strip of cloth from the bottom of his shirt, the cleaner part, and began to work on a crude bandage for his wound. As he worked, he felt her gaze on him, no longer just vacant, but watchful, questioning. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken weight of their shared survival. The night brought a chill that sank deep into his bones. The fever he'd been dreading began to take hold, starting as a tremor in his hands and spreading until his whole body shook. He huddled against the chimney, trying to draw some residual warmth from the stones, but it was no use. The cold was inside him. The girl, whose name he still didn't know, had retreated to a sheltered corner formed by 2 broken walls, curling into a tight ball with her sack doll clutched to her chest. Through the shivers, Silas watched her. In the pale moonlight, she looked even smaller, more fragile. A profound sense of failure washed over him. What had he been thinking? He couldn't protect her. He couldn't even protect himself. He was leading her on a fool's errand that would likely get them both killed. Thorn was out there, relentless as a wolf on a blood trail. And even if they avoided Thorn, the desert itself was an enemy that never slept. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the waves of heat and cold that racked his body. His thoughts grew disjointed, slipping back to the shootout at Flat Rock Pass. The ambush. The look of surprise on his partner's face before he fell. The glint in Jedediah Thorn's eye, not of anger, but of cold, possessive fury. Thorn didn't tolerate disloyalty. Silas had broken the gang's only real rule. All scores were Thorn's. By taking his share and running, Silas had signed his own death warrant. He must have groaned aloud, because the next thing he knew, there was a rustling sound. He opened his eyes to see the girl standing over him. She was holding a small, threadbare blanket, barely big enough for herself. Before he could react, she draped it over his chest. It offered almost no warmth, but the gesture was monumental. It was the second act of kindness she had shown him, a creature who had likely seen precious little of it herself. Her small face was serious in the moonlight, her expression one of solemn purpose. "You keep it," he managed to say through chattering teeth. "You'll freeze." She just shook her head, a quick, jerky motion. Then she did something that stunned him. She sat down beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the faint warmth of her small body. She pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, her gaze fixed on the star-dusted sky. They sat in silence for a long time, a wounded outlaw and a broken child, 2 solitary souls sharing a sliver of warmth against the vast, cold darkness. The fever still raged, but the shivering began to subside, replaced by a strange sense of calm. Her presence was a balm, a quiet anchor in the delirium. For the first time in a decade, Silas Kane didn't feel entirely alone. The next morning, the fever had broken, leaving him weak and drenched in sweat, but clear-headed. The sun was a welcome warmth on his skin. The girl was already up, patiently lowering the tin cup into the well. When she brought him his meager ration of water, he looked at her and made a decision. "We need to have names," he said, his voice stronger now. "I'm Silas." She stared at him, her head cocked to one side. He pointed to his chest. "Silas," then he pointed to her. "You?" She remained silent, her eyes wide. She clutched her doll tighter. He sighed. It was too much, too soon. Of course she wouldn't talk. He tried a different approach. He pointed to her doll. "What about her?" he asked gently. "She got a name?" The girl looked down at the sackcloth figure. Her lips parted, and for a moment, he thought she was going to speak. A tiny, almost inaudible sound escaped her, a soft puff of air. Outlaw. It was barely a whisper, a ghost of a sound, but it was the first word he had heard her utter. It was a start. Ella, he prompted. She shook her head and tried again, concentrating. Lara. Alara, he repeated, the name feeling solid and real. That's a fine name, he looked at the girl. Is that your name? She looked down, suddenly shy, and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was a breakthrough. A name. A connection. She wasn't just the girl anymore. She was Alara. Well, Alara, Silas said, a hint of a smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like years. Looks like it's you and me. Just then, a sound cut through the morning quiet. The howl of a coyote, answered by another, closer this time. Alara flinched, her eyes darting toward the sound, her brief moment of openness vanishing behind the mask of fear. Silas instinctively reached for his gun belt, his hand closing around the familiar worn grip of his Colt. He checked the cylinder. 4 bullets left. Not enough for a fight, but maybe enough to make a loud noise. The coyotes were testing, circling, drawn by the smell of his blood and their shared vulnerability. As the sun began to set, they grew bolder, their shadowy forms flitting between the rocks at the edge of the ruins. Alara pressed herself against the chimney, her small body trembling. She had faced the loss of her family and the loneliness, but the primal fear of predators was something different, something immediate and terrifying. Silas knew he couldn't show fear. He was her protector now. That was the role he had stumbled into, the one he had accepted when he drank the water she'd given him. He built a small fire in the hearth of the chimney, using dry brush and a few splinters of charred wood. The flames licked upward, casting dancing shadows that made the ruins seem even more menacing. The coyote's eyes glinted in the darkness just beyond the firelight. One of them, larger and bolder than the rest, crept closer, its head low, a growl rumbling in its chest. Alara let out a small, stifled cry. That was enough. Silas drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being pulled back unnaturally loud in the silence. He aimed not at the animal, but at the rocks just above its head. He fired. The gunshot was a deafening crack that echoed across the plains. The coyote yelped and scrambled back, and the rest of the pack scattered into the darkness. Silence descended once more, thick with the smell of gunpowder. He had 3 bullets left. He looked at Alara. Her eyes were wide with fright, but she was no longer trembling. She was looking at him, at the gun in his hand, with a new expression. It wasn't just trust. It was awe. In her world of loss and fear, he had become the one who could make the monsters run away. He holstered the pistol, his hand unsteady. The gunshot would have carried for miles. If Thorne's men were anywhere near, he had just sent up a signal flare. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through him. They had to leave. Now. Time to go, Alara, he said, his voice grim. He stamped out the fire, plunging them back into near darkness. He helped her to her feet, his hand briefly touching her small shoulder. She didn't pull away. He took one last look at the ruins, a place of death that had, paradoxically, given him a reason to live. Then, with the moon as their guide and the memory of howling beasts at their heels, they started the long, slow walk towards Silver Creek. The journey was a crucible. The land was unforgiving, a canvas of cracked earth, thorny scrub, and relentless, baking sun. Silas's wound ached with a dull, persistent fire, and his weakness was a constant companion. But he was no longer just a man fleeing a violent past. He was a guardian, and that new purpose lent a surprising strength to his weary limbs. He taught Alara the rhythms of survival as they walked. He showed her how to find shade in the lee of a rock outcropping, how to read the land for the faintest signs of water, a line of hardy green shrubs, the flight path of a finch. He was a patient teacher, his words sparse but clear. He'd point, murmur a single word, lizard, shade, waterweed, and she would watch, absorbing everything with an unnerving focus. She was a quick study, her senses sharpened by the solitude she had endured. In return, she gave him her silence, which slowly began to fill with sound. It started with the faint, tuneless humming he'd first heard. Soon, it evolved into quiet, questioning noises as she pointed at things she didn't know. a hawk circling high above, a strange beetle scurrying across their path. She still wouldn't form full words to him, but she was re-engaging with the world, her curiosity pushing back the fog of her trauma. One afternoon, while they rested in the thin shade of a lone mesquite tree, she pulled something from the pocket of her tattered dress. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its surface worn smooth by countless hours in a small hand. She held it out to him on her palm. He took it gently. The carving was simple but full of life. It was a gift, an offering of the one precious thing she had left in the world. "This is beautiful," he said, his voice thick. "Did your pa make this?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the bird in his hand. For the first time, a flicker of deep sadness crossed her face, a real and present grief that was more heartbreaking than her previous emptiness. He saw the memory of a father's love, a comfortable home, a life that had been stolen from her. He handed the bird back to her carefully. "You hold on to that," he said softly. "You hold on tight." He started talking to her more after that, filling the long silences of their trek. He didn't talk about his past, about the blood and the betrayals. Instead, he told her stories he half remembered from his own fleeting childhood, or tales he'd picked up from old prospectors and cattle drivers around a campfire. He told her about the constellations, giving them names and personalities: the great bear who guarded the sky, the 3 hunters who chased him across the heavens. He pointed out the different colors in the rock strata of a canyon wall, telling her it was the Earth's own storybook. He didn't know if she understood it all, but she listened, her dark eyes fixed on his face, her head tilted. He was speaking not just to fill the silence, but to build a new world for her, one with stories and wonders to replace the one she had lost. On the 4th day, their water ran out. The last of the jerky was long gone. Hunger was a hollow ache in Silas's belly, but thirst was a more immediate and terrifying threat. Alara's steps began to falter, and a faint flush appeared on her cheeks. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of Silas's resolve. He had failed her. He had brought her out into this wasteland only to watch her die. He pushed the thought away, forcing himself to focus. He scanned the horizon, his eyes raw from the sun's glare. Nothing, just endless, shimmering heat. He looked down at Alara. She had stumbled and fallen to her knees, too weary to get up. He knelt beside her. "Just a little longer," he urged, his own voice cracking. "We're going to find some. I promise." It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He picked her up. She was shockingly light, a bundle of bones and grit. He carried her, his own legs protesting with every step, the pain in his side a fresh, sharp agony. He walked for what felt like hours, his vision blurring, his mind starting to play tricks on him. He saw shimmering lakes that vanished as he approached, heard the sound of rushing water that was only the blood pounding in his ears. Just as he was about to collapse, he saw it. A dark stain on the side of a low mesa, a patch of green that was too vibrant to be a mirage. A seep, hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. He staggered toward it, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was real. Water, slow and steady, trickled from a fissure in the rock, pooling in a small, shaded basin. He gently set Alara down and collapsed beside the pool, plunging his hands into the cool water and splashing it on his face. He drank deeply, then filled his canteen. He helped Alara drink, telling her to go slow. She drank with a desperate thirst, water dribbling down her chin. When she was finished, she looked up at him, and her face broke into a weak but genuine smile. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it was like the sun breaking through a week of storm clouds. It hit him with the force of a physical blow, a feeling so pure and potent it almost brought him to his knees. In that moment, he knew he would die for this child. He would face down Jedediah Thorne and the devil himself to keep that smile from fading. They rested by the seep for the rest of the day, regaining their strength. As dusk fell, Silas climbed a small rise to get a better view of the surrounding land. In the distance, nestled in a valley, he saw the faint, flickering lights of a town. Silver Creek. They had made it. Relief washed over him, so profound it left him dizzy. But the relief was short-lived. As they made their way down into the valley the next morning, the town growing closer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Nailed to a tree at a fork in the trail was a piece of paper, already weathered by the sun and wind. A wanted poster. The likeness was crude, but the name was clear: Silas Kane. Wanted for robbery and murder. $1,000. He froze, his body going rigid. Alara, sensing his sudden tension, stopped beside him, her small hand instinctively reaching out to grip the fabric of his trousers. $1,000. That was enough to make a pious man turn bounty hunter. Enough to turn a whole town against him. The murder charge was a lie, Thorne's final twist of the knife, but it wouldn't matter to a sheriff eager for a reputation or a citizen hungry for reward money. He had led Alara out of the desert and into a different kind of danger. The town was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. He looked down at her trusting face. What was he going to do? He could turn back, try to circle around and head for a different town, but they didn't have the supplies. They were out of food, and his wound was beginning to fester again, a dull throb that promised a return of the fever. His mind raced. He could try to disguise himself, but in a town this small, a stranger was always noticed, especially a stranger with a half-starved, silent child in tow. He felt the old instincts rise up in him, the urge to run, to disappear, to cut his losses. He could leave her here, on the outskirts of town. Someone would find her. She was close enough to safety now. He wouldn't be abandoning her in the wilderness. It was the smart play. It was the only way for him to survive. He looked down the trail toward the town, then back at Alara. She was watching him, her expression anxious, sensing the conflict raging within him. Her tiny hand tightened its grip on his leg. She wasn't just a burden he had to discard. She was his responsibility. She trusted him. He remembered her smile by the rock's seep, the feel of her small blanket on his fevered chest. Betraying that trust felt worse than any bullet, worse than any noose. He let out a long, ragged breath. He couldn't do it. He couldn't leave her. Whatever happened in that town, they would face it together. "Come on," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. He reached down and tore the wanted poster from the tree, crumpling it in his fist. "Let's go find you something to eat." As they walked the final mile into Silver Creek, a plan, desperate and fragile, began to form in his mind. He wasn't Silas Kane, the wanted outlaw, anymore. He was a widower, a farmer whose homestead had been struck by sickness. And Alara wasn't a lost orphan he'd found in the ruins. She was his niece, and he was all she had left. It was a flimsy story, full of holes, but it was the only shield he had to offer. Silver Creek was a town clinging to life by a thread. A single dusty main street was flanked by a dozen weathered buildings, a general store, a saloon whose bat-winged doors hung crookedly, a livery, a blacksmith, and a small white church with a leaning steeple. People stopped and stared as they walked into town. They stared at his ragged clothes, at the bloodstain on his shirt, at the gaunt, silent child at his side. He could feel their suspicion like a physical weight, a collective judgment that prickled his skin. He kept his head down, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol, and guided Alara toward the general store. The inside of the store smelled of coffee, leather, and dust. A balding man with a suspicious squint watched them from behind the counter. "Help you?" the man asked, his eyes lingering on Silas's gun. "Need supplies," Silas said, keeping his voice low and even. "And a room. My niece and I have had a long journey." The storekeeper's gaze shifted to Alara, who was hiding behind Silas's leg, peeking out at the shelves stacked high with goods. Her eyes were wide with a kind of wonder Silas hadn't seen in them before. "Boarding house is next to the church," the man said, his tone softening slightly as he looked at the child. "Run by Martha Pringle. She's a good woman. What supplies you need?" Silas bought crackers, cheese, and a small jar of peaches, luxuries he hadn't tasted in years. He also bought a bottle of carbolic acid and clean linen for his wound. As he paid with the last of his coins, he saw the storekeeper glance toward the sheriff's office across the street. The sheriff, a tall man with a drooping mustache and a hard, weary face, was standing on the boardwalk, watching them. Their eyes met for a brief second, and Silas felt a jolt, a current of professional assessment passing between them. The sheriff knew he was trouble. He just didn't know what kind of trouble yet. Silas hurried Alara out of the store, his heart pounding. He had to get off the street. Mrs. Pringle's boarding house was clean but sparse. The woman herself was stern but had kind eyes. She clucked her tongue in sympathy when Silas fed her his story about a fever taking his sister and her husband, leaving him with the girl. She gave them a room at the back, overlooking a small, neglected garden. Once the door was closed, the tension in Silas's shoulders eased slightly. He opened the jar of peaches, and Alara ate them with a fierce, desperate hunger, the sweet syrup dripping down her chin. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked like a child. After she ate, she curled up on the small bed and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, her little wooden bird clutched in her hand. Silas watched her for a long moment, a fierce wave of protectiveness washing over him. This was a mistake. Coming here was a mistake. He was a wolf in a sheep pen, and sooner or later, the shepherd would come calling. He should take her and run now, under the cover of darkness. But as he looked at her sleeping form, so small and peaceful in the clean bed, he knew he couldn't. He couldn't drag her back out into the wilderness. And his wound, it was bad. The area around it was hot and swollen, an angry red that was creeping across his skin. He cleaned it as best he could with the carbolic, the sting making him grit his teeth and break out in a cold sweat. He knew he needed help. There was a town doctor. The storekeeper had mentioned him. Dr. Elias Croft. It was a risk. A doctor would ask questions. But the alternative was letting the infection take him and leaving Alara truly alone. He made his choice. He waited until she was soundly asleep, then slipped out of the room. Dr. Croft's office was a small clapboard house at the end of the street, a single lamp burning in the window. Silas knocked. The door was opened by a man in his late 60s with a fringe of white hair, spectacles perched on his nose, and a gentle, intelligent face. "Can I help you, son?" the doctor asked. I have a wound," Silas said, his voice low. "Needs looking at." Dr. Croft led him into his surgery, a room that smelled of rubbing alcohol and herbs. He examined Silas's side without a word, his expression growing serious. "Gunshot," he stated, not a question. "Looks a few days old. And badly infected. You're lucky to be standing." As the doctor cleaned and stitched the wound with practiced hands, he began to ask quiet questions. Not about the gunshot, but about Alara. Mrs. Pringle, it seemed, was the town's primary source of news. "The little girl," the doctor said, tying off a suture. "Your niece?" "Yes, sir," Silas replied, his body tense. "She's been through a great ordeal, I imagine," Dr. Croft continued, dabbing the wound with a cool salve. "She's very quiet. The fever took her folks. She hasn't spoken since. It was a lie built on a shard of truth, and it felt vile on his tongue." The doctor finished his work, wrapping Silas's torso in a clean, tight bandage. "There, that should hold. But you'll need to rest. No hard riding for at least a week. I'll check on you tomorrow," he paused, looking Silas directly in the eye. "I'll look in on the child, too. Shock can do strange things to a young mind." Silas nodded, paid the man the last of his money, and left. He felt a sliver of hope. The doctor seemed like a decent man, someone who cared more about healing than asking questions. Perhaps they could stay here for a few days, just long enough for him to heal, for Alara to get some real food in her belly. Then they could disappear. But as he stepped back onto the dark street, a shadow detached itself from the alleyway across from him. It was the sheriff. "Evening," the sheriff said, his voice a low rumble. "Name's Miller." "Harris," Silas lied, his hand twitching toward his gun. "John Harris." "Just passing through, Mr. Harris?" Sheriff Miller asked, his eyes sharp and probing. "That's the plan. Funny thing," Miller went on, stepping closer. "Saw a poster a few days back. For a man named Kane. Looked a bit like you. Said he was wanted for robbery. And for killing his partner." Silas's blood ran cold. This was it. The trap was sprung. "Never heard of him," Silas said, his voice flat and hard. The sheriff stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Silas could see the calculation in the man's eyes, the $1,000 bounty warring with the uncertainty. Finally, Miller just nodded slowly. "See that you keep it that way," he said, before turning and walking back toward his office. It wasn't an exoneration. It was a warning. "I'm watching you." Silas returned to the boarding house, his false sense of security shattered. They were living on borrowed time. Every friendly face in this town was a potential enemy. Every quiet street a potential ambush. He sat in the chair by the window, watching Alara sleep, his pistol in his lap. He wouldn't sleep that night. He had brought her to a sanctuary that was really a cage, and now the hunters were circling, not just from the wilderness behind him, but from within the very walls of the town meant to be their refuge. The next few days passed in a state of suspended tension. Silas rarely left the room, his senses on high alert for any sign of trouble. Dr. Croft visited as promised, bringing a broth for Alara and changing Silas's dressing. The doctor had a gentle way about him. He didn't press Alara to speak, but sat with her, showing her how to fold a piece of paper into the shape of a bird to match the one she carried. Under his quiet care, a little more of the light returned to her eyes. She even offered the doctor a small, shy smile. Silas watched their interactions with a mix of gratitude and dread. The doctor's kindness was a complication. It made their flimsy story feel more real, and the thought of having to run again, to snatch Alara away from this first glimmer of stability, felt like a cruelty he wasn't sure he could inflict. His bond with the child was deepening with every shared meal, every quiet evening. He had started to feel less like a temporary guardian and more like something else, something he didn't dare put a name to. One afternoon, while Silas was cleaning his pistol, a task that always settled his nerves, Alara did something new. She had been sitting on the floor, tracing patterns in the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam. She picked up her sack doll, the one he had assumed was just a comfort object, and began to fiddle with a loose seam at its back. She pulled at the thread, her small fingers working with intense concentration. A small, folded piece of oilcloth fell out from the stuffing. Silas stopped what he was doing. Alara picked up the oilcloth and crawled over to him, holding it up. He took it from her. It was a letter, the ink faded and water-stained in places, but still legible. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat, precise. It was dated 2 weeks prior. "My dearest Sarah," it began. "The survey is nearly complete. The railroad men will be pleased. The new vein I marked is richer than any of us imagined. But I have a dark feeling about Mr. Thorne. He is not the simple land agent he pretends to be. He watches the maps with a hungry eye, and his men are not surveyors. They are gunslingers." He spoke of clearing the valley, and his smile did not reach his eyes. "I have made a second copy of the map, the true one showing the full extent of the silver lode, and hidden it. If anything should happen to me, take Alara and go to your brother in Silver Creek. Give him the map. Do not trust Thorne. He is a wolf. Your loving husband, Thomas." Silas read the letter 3 times, the words burning themselves into his mind. Thomas. That was her father's name. And the man who had destroyed her family was not some random raider. It was Jedediah Thorne. His Thorne. The man who had hired Silas and his partner as extra guns. The man Silas had robbed and fled from. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The attack on the homestead wasn't random. Thorne wasn't just chasing Silas for the stolen payroll. He was after this map. He must have believed Thomas had the map on him, and when he didn't find it, he burned the evidence and everyone with it. But he hadn't found the map, and now, Silas realized with a jolt of ice-cold certainty, Thorne would be coming here, to Silver Creek, following the only lead he had left, the brother mentioned in the letter. He looked at Alara, who was watching his face, her own expression troubled by the grim look in his eyes. She had been carrying the key to her family's murder inside her doll the whole time. The weight of his own involvement crashed down on him. He had worked for that monster. He had taken his money. He was complicit. The thought made him sick. His immediate instinct was to run, to grab Alara and disappear before Thorne arrived. But the letter had changed everything. This wasn't just about his survival anymore. It was about justice for Alara's family. The map was the proof of Thorne's motive. And her uncle was here, in this very town. A new, terrifying thought emerged. What if Thorne got to him first? He had to find the brother. He folded the letter and tucked it carefully into his own pocket. "Alara," he said, his voice urgent. "Listen to me. I have to go out for a little while. I need you to stay here. Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me or Dr. Croft. Do you understand?" She looked frightened, but she nodded, her eyes wide and serious. He felt a pang of guilt for leaving her, but he had no choice. He slipped out of the boarding house and made his way to the doctor's office. It was a long shot, but the doctor was the most connected man he knew. Dr. Croft listened intently as Silas, choosing his words carefully, explained that he'd found a letter from Alara's father mentioning an uncle in town. He omitted the parts about Thorne and the map. "Her mother's name was Sarah," Silas said. "Sarah Gable. Her brother would have the same last name. The doctor stroked his chin, his brow furrowed in thought. Gable. Gable. The only Gable I know in Silver Creek is the blacksmith. Samuel Gable. A quiet man. Keeps to himself. Lost his wife a few years back. The blacksmith. Of course. Silas felt a surge of adrenaline. Thank you, doctor. He found Samuel Gable shoeing a horse, the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel echoing from his workshop. He was a large, powerfully built man with sorrowful eyes and a beard threaded with gray. Silas waited until he was finished, then approached him cautiously. Mr. Gable. The blacksmith turned, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. Hi. My name is John Harris. I need to talk to you. About your sister, Sarah. Gable's face hardened, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. I have no business with any friend of the man who got my sister killed. Silas froze. What are you talking about? The company man. Thorne. Gable spat, his voice thick with rage and grief. He came through here a week ago. Said her husband had an accident at the survey site. Said he was looking for some company papers Thomas might have sent here for safekeeping. I knew he was lying. I could smell it on him. Thorne had already been here. The thought sent a chill down Silas's spine. He was a step behind. He's the man who killed them, Silas said, his voice low and intense. All of them. And he's coming back. He's looking for a map. I have a letter from Thomas. It explains everything. He pulled out the scorched letter and handed it to the blacksmith. Gable's big hands trembled as he read it. His face, already etched with grief, crumpled. A single tear traced a path through the soot on his cheek. Alara. Gable whispered, the name a ragged breath. He said, Thorne said there were no survivors. He lied, Silas said. She's alive. I found her. She's here in town. Before Gable could react, the sound of hoofbeats filled the air. Not one horse, but half a dozen, riding into town at a confident, deliberate pace. Silas's heart sank. He recognized the man in the lead instantly. Jedediah Thorne. He was a man of contrasts, impeccably dressed in a fine black coat, but with the cold, dead eyes of a snake. He rode with an air of absolute authority, his 5 men fanning out behind him like a pack of wolves. They were too late. Thorne had returned. The showdown he had been running from had finally found him, and it had found him in a town where he was a wanted man, with the only family a little girl had left in the world standing right beside him. Jedediah Thorne dismounted in front of the saloon with the fluid grace of a predator. His gaze swept the street, missing nothing, his lips curved in a slight, confident smile. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to collect what he believed was his. His eyes landed on the blacksmith shop, on Silas and Samuel Gable standing frozen in the doorway. The smile widened. Well, Thorne called out, his voice carrying easily in the sudden silence that had fallen over the town. Silas Kane, I should have known you'd scurry to the nearest hole. And it seems you've made a friend. Sheriff Miller emerged from his office, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. Thorne, didn't expect you back so soon. Just tying up loose ends, Sheriff, Thorne said smoothly, turning his attention to Miller. It appears I've found the man who murdered his partner and robbed my payroll. That's him right there. Silas Kane. There's a handsome reward for him, as I recall. The few townsfolk on the street began to murmur, their suspicious glances turning on Silas. He was trapped. Thorne had branded him a killer and a thief, using the law itself as his weapon. He's the killer, Gable roared, taking a step forward, his hands clenched into massive fists. He murdered my sister and her husband. Thorne feigned surprise. My dear Mr. Gable, your grief is understandable. But you are mistaken. The man you should be angry with is Kane. He was seen near your sister's homestead right after the unfortunate fire. I believe he's the one responsible. Perhaps he was looking for those papers I mentioned. He paused, letting his words sink in. And I hear a child survived. Tell me, Kane, did you take the girl, too? What sick game are you playing? It was a masterful stroke. In a few sentences, Thorne had painted Silas as a murderer, a thief, and a kidnapper, all while positioning himself as the righteous victim. The sheriff's face was a mask of conflict, his gaze shifting between Silas, Thorne, and the grieving blacksmith. Silas knew he couldn't win this with fists or guns. Not yet. He had to use the truth. He's lying, Silas said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs. Thorne is the one who burned that homestead. He was looking for a map, a survey map your brother made, Gable. A map that showed a silver lode. Thorn wanted all for himself. He pulled the letter from his pocket. This is from Thomas Gable, written the day before he was murdered. It names Thorn. It says he feared for his family's life. He held the letter out. Sheriff Miller hesitated, then walked forward and took it. As he read, his expression hardened. Thorn's smile faltered for the first time. A convenient forgery, Thorn scoffed, but a flicker of unease showed in his eyes. The man is a desperate outlaw. He'll say anything to save his own skin. Just then, a small figure appeared in the doorway of the boarding house down the street. It was Alara. She must have heard the commotion and disobeyed his order to stay inside. Her eyes, wide with fear, scanned the crowd until they landed on Silas. Then her gaze shifted, moving past him to the man in the black coat. A tremor went through her small body. Her face, which had slowly been regaining its life and color, turned pale as ash. The blank, traumatized look he'd first seen in the ruins returned, but this time it was mixed with a raw, primal terror. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Thorn saw her. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of cruel recognition dawning on his face. Ah, the little orphan. It seems she remembers me. He took a step toward her. Come here, child. I'll take care of you. That was his mistake. As he moved toward her, something inside Alara broke. The dam of silence that had held back her grief and terror for weeks finally burst. No, the word was a raw, piercing scream that ripped through the tense silence of the street. It was a child's cry of pure anguish and defiance. Every head turned toward her. She stood there, trembling from head to foot, her small arm outstretched, her finger pointing directly at Jedediah Thorn. Fire, she whispered, the word choked and hoarse. Then louder, her voice gaining strength with every memory that flooded back. The fireman. He hurt Mama. Bad man. The spell was broken. The townspeople were no longer looking at Silas, the wanted outlaw. They were looking at a terrified little girl accusing the well-dressed gentleman of an unspeakable crime. They saw the genuine horror in her eyes and the predatory stillness in Thorn's. Samuel Gable let out a roar of pure rage and lunged for Thorn, but Silas grabbed his arm. Not like this, Silas hissed. This has to be done right. Dr. Croft had appeared, drawn by the shouting. He went immediately to Alara's side, scooping her up and holding her close as she began to sob, the words pouring out of her now in a torrent of fragmented memories, smoke, shouting, the bad fireman. Sheriff Miller folded the letter and tucked it into his coat pocket. He looked at Thorn, his eyes cold as steel. Thorn, you and your men will hand over your guns. You're under arrest on suspicion of murder. Thorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You and what army, Sheriff? I have 5 men. You have a blacksmith and a wanted killer. He's right, Sheriff, Silas said quietly, stepping forward. He looked Thorn directly in the eye. This isn't your fight. This is between me and him. He unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the dust. No guns. Just you and me, Thorn. For the map. For the money. For her. Thorn's eyes glittered. He was a prideful man, and Silas had just publicly challenged his authority, man to man. He couldn't back down now without losing face. He slowly, deliberately, unbuckled his own gun belt. You've made your last mistake, Kane, he snarled. The fight was brutal and short. Thorn was strong, but his fighting was saloon brawling, wild and angry. Silas fought with the cold, desperate efficiency of a survivor. He took a hard blow to the jaw that sent stars bursting behind his eyes, another to his wounded side that made him cry out in pain. But he stayed on his feet. He saw Alara's terrified face over the doctor's shoulder, and it fueled him. He was no longer fighting for himself. He was fighting for her future, for the memory of her family, for the chance to cleanse the stain of his own past. He saw an opening and drove his fist into Thorn's gut, doubling him over. As Thorn gasped for air, Silas brought his hands up and together, striking him hard at the base of the neck. Thorn collapsed into the dust, unconscious. His men, who had been watching with confident smirks, suddenly found themselves staring down the barrels of Sheriff Miller's shotgun and a rifle held by the storekeeper, who had appeared on the boardwalk. They slowly raised their hands. The fight was over. Silence fell once more, broken only by Alara's quiet sobs. The dust settled on Main Street, leaving behind the quiet aftermath of the storm. Thorne and his men were disarmed and locked in the sheriff's 2 small cells, their arrogance replaced by sullen silence. Samuel Gable stood over the unconscious form of his sister's murderer, his chest heaving, his face a mask of grief and grim satisfaction. The townsfolk, who had minutes before been ready to condemn Silas, now watched him with a mixture of awe and respect. Silas ignored them all. He pushed himself up from the ground, every muscle screaming in protest, the wound in his side a searing agony. His only focus was the small, sobbing child in the doctor's arms. He limped toward them, his world narrowing to her face. Dr. Croft gently set her down. Alara ran the last few feet and threw her arms around Silas's legs, burying her face against him, her small body shaking. He sank to one knee, ignoring the fiery pain, and wrapped his arms around her. He held her tight, one hand stroking her tangled hair, murmuring soft, comforting words. "It's over now," he whispered, his voice thick. "It's all over. You're safe." She looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her voice, when she spoke, was small but clear. "You saved me, Silas." He felt something break loose inside his chest, a wall he had spent a lifetime building. He simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. She reached up with her tiny hand, the one that had first touched him in the ruins, and gently placed it on his bruised cheek. Her touch was not a question, but a statement. It was a claim. It anchored his scarred, drifting soul in a way he had never thought possible. Sheriff Miller walked over, holding the crumpled wanted poster Silas had torn from the tree. He looked from Silas to the weeping child clinging to him, then down at the poster in his hand. With a decisive rip, he tore it in two, then in two again, and let the pieces flutter into the dust. "Reckon the territory owes you a debt, not the other way around," Miller said gruffly. "The $1,000 for Thorne's capture should be enough to get you and the girl a fresh start." He looked over at Samuel Gable. "A start here, perhaps, if you choose." Gable came and knelt beside them, his large, calloused hand resting on Alara's shoulder. "She's my blood," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "She belongs here, with family." He looked at Silas, his eyes full of a gratitude that needed no words. "And so do you. You brought my family back to me." Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Silas sat on the porch of the doctor's office. His side was freshly bandaged, his jaw ached, but for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt a sense of peace. Alara was asleep in his lap, her head resting on his chest, her breathing soft and even. Her silence was truly broken, her trauma given a voice and now, finally, a chance to heal. Her little wooden bird lay on the porch rail beside them, a silent testament to the past they had overcome. He looked out at the mountains, painted purple and gold by the setting sun. He was no longer running. He was no longer just a scout, or an outlaw, or a survivor. He looked down at the child sleeping in his arms, her tiny hand clutching one of his fingers as if she would never let go. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had finally found his way home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.